Welcome to the church, Sag Harbor. How are you this evening?
Good.
Nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us. How many of us are joining at the church for the very first time? Wow, just one person. Well, welcome back, everybody. What a loyal crowd. Okay, great. Okay, now that we're all being honest, right? It's more. Thank you for coming back. We really appreciate you, and we really appreciate the village of Sag Harbor and all of the East End community that helps keep us going year-round. As you know, we present extraordinary programming across all artistic disciplines, and tonight's program is no exception. It's a wonderful inclusion in our ongoing programming surrounding Handmade exhibition in two parts, consisting of Guitars According to G.E. Smith and Hands from the American Artists Hand Archive. It's a wonderful show. Hope you get to explore it more at another time. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce the legendary man that you were all here to see this evening, working with G on this exhibition alongside Eric Fischel and Sarah Cochran, our curatorial team, dream team, has been a true wonder. GE is not only one of the world's foremost guitarists, and I say world, I'm not being hyperbolic. This is one of the most accomplished solo guitarists alive. In addition to that, we've come to find that he is somebody with an encyclopedic brain about music, culture, history, religion, and philosophy. I'm probably making him blush. And because of that, brings an extraordinary context to his understanding to the guitar as an object made by makers, made by people that become a conduit for another form of art that is created by another soul. It's a really wonderful journey, and it's well encapsulated in this human being, and I'm pleased to present G.E. Smith.
Well, I think Sherry covered it. Thank you. I'm glad that she said about the people that made the instruments, you know, because that is something that is so important. Even the really mass-produced ones, like some of the electric guitars, and they make thousands and thousands of them every year. There's still people there, you know, make them. Even now they have these things called CDC machines, these computers, and you put a chunk of wood in at one end, and a guitar neck comes out the other end. Well, it's not completely finished. A person still has to take that and finish the shaping and make sure the frets are on it right. And how many people here play guitar? The guilty parties. Because, you know, this is all I've ever done since I was a little kid, was play the guitar and think about guitars and drive all over the country looking for guitars, and which was a lot more fun before the computers, you know, before eBay. You could actually go to some town and find stuff. You know, there was stuff still around. Although just this morning, a buddy of mine that lives in Queens sent me a text, and he said, my 89-year-old neighbor wants to sell his guitar. And he showed me a picture, and it's actually this really good guitar. So stuff can still turn up. It's still out there. It's a big country. They've made millions of guitars. It's the most popular instrument in the history of the world. More people play and have played the guitar than maybe all the other instruments combined. They still sell 3 million guitars every year. Where are they all going? You know? Now, they're not all like expensive, good guitars. They're, you know, there's starter grade stuff, but they're still selling a lot of guitars. There's still young people learning to play, which is amazing to me, because if you listen to the radio now and you listen to a lot of popular music, there's not really a whole lot of guitars in most of it anymore. Some of it, as guitarists. But a lot of it, guitars, it's all computers. People can now make really good records with a laptop. They can sit in their kitchen with a laptop and make a really good record. Different times, things change. And some of the guitars that we're going to look at, we'll see how things changed over time. So, when I was 4 years old, I went down in the I came from Pennsylvania, a small town in Pennsylvania. I went down in the basement with my mom. She was doing the laundry. And we get down there, and I see something hanging up on the wall in the basement. I said, "What's that?" She said, "That's a guitar." "Oh, can I have it?" "Okay." It belonged to my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, but we call him Uncle George, a guy named after him. And so she gave it to me. Now, I wish I still had that. It was a cheapo acoustic guitar, probably cost $5 or something when it was new in the 30s. It was made in Chicago, where a lot of instruments were made back pre-World War II days. A lot of instruments were made in Chicago. We'll see a couple of Chicago guitars this evening. But so I took it. Now I'm 4. I'm not going to play it right away. I took it out back, and I was, probably just dragging it around. But I was hearing the strings vibrating, And then I got to the point I would lay down on the ground and I'd lay it in front of me like this. This might have been the whole next summer when I was 5. It took me that long to progress maybe to this point. But I'd lay there and I'd go, and I'd watch that string vibrate. And at some point, it hit my little kid brain and the vibration was making the sound. And like the whole world snapped together for me. I can really remember that moment, that instant. I went, oh, because like when you were a tiny little baby, everything's just kind of, everything's all everything. And it's just swirling together, and they feed you, and they keep you warm, and they clean you and stuff. But I went, oh, the buildings have edges, and the sky is up, and the ground is down. I got it all because of that, So then from that point on, I was hopeless. I was obsessed. So I went on banging on that guitar for a couple of years. Then it's the summer that I was 7, that same Uncle George that guitar had belonged to. See, I'm already driving my wife out of the room. She's heard all this. She's been listening to this for 35 years, Somehow 7, that same Uncle George comes over, and he's got this girlfriend from New York City. Yeah. And they come out in the yard, and she sees me with that guitar, and she goes, "Oh, do you want a real guitar?" I'm 7. What am I going to say? No. Yeah. So she shows up a couple days later and actually gives me a Martin guitar, which is a good guitar, made in Pennsylvania. A lower grade Martin, but still, they're all good. She gives me a Martin, but more importantly, she brings along her 14 or 15-year-old Irish nanny, who's taking care of her kids, who plays and sings and has red hair. I'm like, yeah, okay. So she showed me how to make some chords and probably how to tune it up right, because who knows what I was doing before that. And she got me going, and I was so lucky. I'm only 7, and somebody showed me, here's if you want to go with it, here's the road you gotta take. I still have the piece of paper where she wrote down the words. She taught me this old Irish song called Mari's Wedding. Step we gaily, on we go, heel for heel and toe for toe, all for Mari's wedding. I still have that piece of paper where she wrote that down. I can't remember her name, but thanks to her, I got started. So then I was just obsessed. That's all I did. I mean, I went to school, My dad, fortunately, had taught me to read when I was real little. So I could read, and I loved to read books. And the guitar all went together with that. The books, you know, I read Moby Dick when I was about 10. And the guitar went with that for me somehow. When I was 11, I got an offer from some people in town to play where I could make a little money. So my mom took me shopping. We're going to get now an electric guitar. And there wasn't much on offer in our little town. There was this one right here, used, and then there was a Gibson's, a Fender, and there was a Gibson that was beautiful, with pearl inlays on the fingerboard and a lot of knobs, and I wanted that Gibson, you know? But the Gibson was $200, and this was $100. So what did we get? We got this one. My mom paid it off $15 a month at Monroe County National Bank, Pennsylvania, and I still have it. And this guitar right here is what made my whole life, what I turned out to be. I've used this with everybody that I've ever worked with, all kinds of people. I played this with Bob Dylan extensively. I think every show I did with Bob, I used this guitar. Played it on Saturday Night Live and all kinds of different people that I worked for. I used this guitar. So thanks to my mom and the good luck that we only had $100 and not 200, I got this, and it really made it for me. So I'd like you guys, please, to be as quiet as you can. Listen. What do we hear? We hear the air system in place, right? The HVAC. There's almost nowhere that we can go now in 2022, and it's been that way for most of our lives, that's quiet. But way back when, this is the oldest guitar that's in this show. This one was made around 1810 in Italy. And back then it was quiet. Back in the late 80s or early 90s or something, I did a thing for the Martin Guitar Company. There's two great big acoustic guitar companies in the United States, Gibson and Martin. Martin from Pennsylvania, and Gibson was originally from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Now they're in Nashville. But when I did this thing for Martin, they wanted me to go. They have a museum with guitars. Martin started in 1833 in Manhattan. They had a guitar from 1834. They've never found an 1833 one, but they did have one from 1834, so I took that one. I took one from the Civil War era. I took one from the end of the 19th century, then some of the 20th century ones coming up. And I learned to play music. What did someone walk into a store in 1834 and buy a guitar? What did they want to play? You know, I wanted to find out. But the big thing I found out when I was doing that research was that it was really, really quiet back then. The loudest thing almost anywhere was the church bell. Of course, that didn't ring all day long. Now maybe as the 19th century progressed, a train would be coming by, and that train would make some noise. But that only lasted a couple minutes, you know. Then they started having some factories, but the factories were generally outside of town. In town, it was quiet. So they didn't have to make loud guitars. Now, like I said, this guitar's from about 1810. I know it's before 1820 because this guitar's from about 1890. But by 1820 or so, this part here, what they call the fingerboard, this piece of wood, extends, as you see, down over the body. If you can see on this guitar here, the frets, these cross pieces, which is you press the string down on and it makes the different notes, extend right up onto the body. They're made out of ivory on this guitar. And you see they're set right in the top of the instrument. See that? Instead of a fingerboard that extends down here, which all guitars have now, it's got those ivory frets and they're set right in the top. What do you think about that, Carlos? Right in there. That's Carlos Barrios over there. He knows about guitars. He makes them. Yeah, the frets go right down onto the body. So, this guitar also has these kind of tuners like you see on violins and stuff. It's just wood, and it goes right into the hole in the what they call the headstock, this piece up here, and it's just friction that holds it in place. They're hard to get in tune, these guitars. You know, I don't know what they did back then. Anyway, it was really, really quiet. It's too bad we can't turn that off and hear, but that's the modern world. They didn't have to be loud. And also, a thing that you see on a lot of these old guitars, it's got this little hole in the top, and they would hang it on the wall. I don't know if everybody's walked around the exhibit, but back there in the corner, there's some the cases from these 19th century guitars, and they're referred to as coffin cases because they're almost all painted black, and they're just simple, made out of wood. It looks like a coffin. In fact, when I go, put me in one of those. So when I was, did any of you guys have like a 6 o'clock dinner reservation? I could go on.
Please do.
So I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I've talked to a lot of people over the years and done as much research as I possibly could. Where did this guitar come from? Okay, where did this instrument, stringed instruments, violins, cellos, all that stuff, mandolins, how did that get started? Well, the nearest anybody can figure out, at some point, definitely in Africa, but at the same era, probably in China, Mongolia, different places in the world, somebody is cleaning an animal that they've killed to eat, and something twangs in there. And we pretty much know that it came from that because of all the early instruments, they used gut to make the strings. There's still Spanish-style guitar players, classical guitar players, where a lot of those guitars now use nylon strings, but they were gut strings back in the 19th century. There are still people that play on the gut string. They still make them. And they make them out of sheep gut. You hear people say cat gut. It's not cat gut. Cats aren't big enough. Think about it. It's sheep gut. And they're gut strings. I've tried them. They're really interesting. They're kind of beautiful sounding, but they don't last very long. You know, a couple of hours, and you're not really getting a whole lot of sound. Anyway, way back, thousands and thousands and thousands. Somebody hears that, And they go, whoa, that's a nice sound. So they cut it out. And they go over to their friend and they hold it and they say, here, pluck on that. Whoa, that's cool. And right away, some inventive person in the area goes, well, wait a minute, let's hook that onto a tree so we don't have to hold it. Now they can just stand there. Now they can dance, sing, you know, they get that going. Somebody goes, well, what if we took a hollow gourd and stretched that across the top of it? I wasn't there. I don't know exactly that this happened, but it's close to this. And remember, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in China, it's happening in Mongolia, it's happening in different places in the world, all at the same time. On the hollow gourd, now it's loud. Now it's got resonance. It's got low end. It's got bass. Whoa, this is getting exciting. Well, some clever person comes along and says, let's put 2 pieces of gut on there. Boing, boing, bing, bong, bing. Now we got 2 notes. Okay? Now we got harmony. They've invented harmony. Another clever person comes along hundreds of years later, maybe, or maybe the week after, who knows, and says, if we put a stick in the end of that gourd, we could make the strings real long. And it'd be more, louder, bigger. This is a theme. Louder, bigger, more. You're going to see this as I speak here in the next few minutes. It's a theme that runs all the way through. Stick, like the neck of a guitar. The gourd. A couple of pieces of gut on there. Well, right away somebody figures, wait, if I press my finger down on the piece of gut on that stick, it makes a different note. Darn, ding, 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 you know, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. They're off and running. Going. This goes on. Thousands of years, refinements. Somebody figures out I can tie other pieces of gut around the stick and make those frets. For many years before those ivory frets that you saw on that 1810 Italian guitar, it was just pieces of gut tied all the way around the neck for the frets. Today, when they make a guitar, where those frets are placed, it's crucial because that's how you're in tune, and that's how, when you make chords, it sounds sweet. You know, if you're just playing single notes, it's still really important where the frets are. But if you still were at the 1 string phase, if we had never gone beyond that, and you were just going to go, okay. But if you're going to play chords, blending of a bunch of different notes, those frets have to be very precisely placed. They, of course, like everything else, today they figured it out with computers, and they have this machine that sets the frets, and it's a computer, and they're perfect. This guitar was made in the 30s, so this was still by hand. It was still somebody standing there with a hammer and a ruler, basically, you know. So, at some point, it's gone from 2 pieces of gut to 3 pieces of gut. It gets up into Italy, Germany, Spain, France, of course, England. It gets up in there in the form of, in North Africa, they had developed an instrument called an oud, which you might have seen people playing now. Oud doesn't have frets, okay? It's like a violin doesn't have frets. You just have to really learn where to put your fingers. You have to really listen. Anyway, this North African instrument called the oud had been around for who knows how many thousands of years, had developed into having more and more pieces of gut on it, so you had more notes available, more kinds of chords. And guys brought those ouds across the Mediterranean into Europe. And then they started making, they made different things. There was a thing, the lute, which comes from oud, lute, right? It's just a different pronunciation of the same word. Different luthiers, guitar maker people, inventors, developed different styles. Now this is, we're still talking like way back now. We're talking like the 1400s. You see in paintings back then, somewhere somebody will be standing playing a lute. Or there was an instrument called a vihuela, which was made in Spain and became pretty popular. And they made all kinds of wild, giant, big ones with huge extended necks and great big long strings that you could play bass notes on. You know, so you go boom, and then a chord. And, tried all kinds of things, but really the lute and the vihuela are the two things that turned into guitars. And by sometime in the 1500s or so, although there's almost none of these instruments that survive from back then, they've got either 3 or 4 strings, but tuning wasn't standard. Today, we tune the guitar from low to high, E, A, D, G, B, E. Okay, so there's 2 E's on there. So there's really 5 notes with 6 strings. Back then, you would tune in the style of your region. If you came from the area around Milan, you had a tuning that they used in that area. If you came from the area around Paris, they had a tuning, or you would just tune it to your voice. If you were somebody that had a nice high voice, you would tune it where it was good for you. Or if you accompanied a singer all the time, if your sister was a great singer and you accompanied her, you figured out how to tune that guitar to where you could play with her. This goes on and on. By then, particularly in Spain, but also a little bit in southern Germany, and they're making guitars. They look like guitars, they're calling them guitars. They only have 5 strings. Today, guitars all have 6 strings, unless they have more, but 6 for the standard. And but they had 5 strings up until around 1780 or so. This is all rough, you know? It's all rough because there's not a lot of instruments that survive from back in that period. Even Stradivarius, the famous violin maker Stradivarius, he made a few guitars. And his guitars were what they call 6 courses, so it was 6 doubled. So there were 12 strings on it, or 10, 5 courses, because it was 5-string guitars, but he made a couple with 6, but doubled. So there'd be 10 or 12. You know, the same note, the same note, the same, 2 of the same. Like, but by the late 1700s, now they put the 6th string on, which to my understanding is the low string. And they've standardized the tuning. And for many years I wondered, why did they finally standardize the tuning to what we have now? Low E, A, D, G, B, E. It was so they could write it down, write music, like they had always been writing music for the piano, the keyboard instruments, for violins. Now, guitar had gained a tiny bit of respect. It was a barroom instrument. It still is. But it was a barroom instrument. It was a troubadour instrument. You know, that's one of the reasons the guitar got so popular. You can carry it around. You can't really take your piano over to your girlfriend's house and serenade her, right? It's tough. You gotta have a bunch of strong guys that are your friends that carry that piano down the road. Anyway, guitar you can take anywhere. You can travel from town to town, make a little money, hopefully, at least maybe get a meal and a drink. Okay, so call it by 1800 or so. They got 6 strings, standardized tuning all over the Western world, because in China, and they're not playing guitars, in China they got an instrument called a pipa. It's a stringed instrument with frets. It looks completely different. It's got a kind of a teardrop shaped body and a long neck, and the frets are real high. But anyway, string music, but guitars, which is what I'm here for, are now 6 strings, and they look like our little Italian friend, wherever he wound up. They look like this. And the world's still real quiet, so they don't have to be big, and they don't have to be real loud, and the gut strings are fine, and they're going along like that. As right away, for some reason, in the 19th century, in Europe, there started to be some people that could really make good instruments. And there was a man named Christian Frederick Martin, and he was working in Vienna with another guitar maker named Johann Stauffer, and he learned from him. And Christian Martin came to the United States in 1833, and of course they land. The boat pulls in down at the bottom of Manhattan, around like Battery Park, what we now call Battery Park. Down there, it comes up the Hudson just barely, you know, and lands, him and his wife, and they had a couple of real little kids, and they're walking up Hudson Street. And right around where the entrance to the Holland Tunnel is now, like by Canal Street and 6th Avenue, I think, and I know this is completely romantic nonsense, but I think his wife said, "Chris, I'm tired. Would you please rent someplace for us to go or get us somewhere to go? We just did that long boat ride and the kids are tired, and come on." So he sees a shop, a building, a little storefront that's for rent. He goes in there. He starts his shop in 1833, Christian Frederick Martin. Turned into one of the greatest guitar makers ever, and the company is still alive and well. They're in Nazareth, Pennsylvania now. But major, almost all of the acoustic guitars made now are heavily influenced by Martin's. Martin kind of defined the American acoustic guitar. Of course, now they have steel strings. I'll talk about when that started. That's like right at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. So this is a Martin guitar made about 1890. Now, even by 1890, they're not very big yet, are they? Because it's still pretty quiet. The world is still pretty quiet in 1890. Cars are going to come soon, and that's going to force people to get loud. You know, trucks and cars and more machinery in the home. You know, electricity is going to come. Did you ever read that thing about electricity when Thomas Edison wasn't the only guy that invented it, but he got the credit. Anyway, he's over there in New Jersey, and he gets electricity figured out to where he's going to have lights. They figured out you ever see those big old light bulbs with the glowing piece of metal in the middle? He figures that out. He offers it to Newark, New Jersey, because they're right next door. They go, "Nah, we got gas lamps, we're good." Right? He goes, "Fine." Offers it to Manhattan. They're like, "Are you kidding? Why would we want that? All those wires, why would we want to pay for that?" So Thomas Edison, he gets kind of pissed off, and he goes over to Paris, and he says, "Here, you can have it. You don't even have to pay me." That's why Paris is called the City of Lights. That's a true story. Nobody here wanted it. Well, they figured out later that they'd need it. Anyway, this is a little Martin guitar from 1890, and it's just a great instrument. Martin made great instruments from 1833, and they're still making them. Just fantastic. This one hanging right here is from, I believe, 1971. It's a high-end Martin. You see how much bigger they got. This one's got steel strings. It's about 5 times as loud as this. And it's got the pearl inlays and stuff. Martin resisted doing that. He didn't want to do that company. They did not want to do the flashy stuff. They got forced into it later. But so too much attitude even for me. Right after the Civil War, for young ladies of quality, before the Civil War, they learned to play the piano. Or if they were real rebels, maybe the violin, but that was frowned on, you know. A woman had to move, you can't have that, you know. But they could sit at the piano and play, that was okay. Right after the Civil War, for some reason, guitar became popular. And Martin, in New York City, started selling a lot of, well, actually by then they had moved, but they were in Nazareth. But they started selling a lot of guitars to women. And a lot of women got real good right away. And that's an interesting thing that happened. I don't know all the reasons for it, you know, but I think it's really cool. And then you see, because by then we got photography starting to come in, you know, and you see these photos of these women, you know, in the 1870s and the 1880s with guitars, and they're playing, and a bunch of them, maybe 8 or 10, and they'd get together and give anything to hear it, you know, what they were playing, like. Big hit from the Civil War. Big hit. Another one. This was the biggest hit of the Civil War. This song was such a big hit that often, the night before a big battle, the South, the North, they'd sing it across to each other. Then in the morning, they get up and kill each other. See? Music. And check this out. I bet you know this one. That was called The Girl I Left Behind. Biggest hit of the Civil War. It came from an old Irish song called The Waxies Dargle. Now the Waxies were the people that made candles. And the Waxies Dargle was this convention that they had every year, which was basically a drinking festival. But they would get together every year. We'd go to the Waxies Dargle. There's a great version of that by the Pogues. If you go on YouTube, and they give it the proper reading, I think. But when I'd be researching, you know, these old, why did they buy a guitar in these different times, and I heard all these old songs, we still know these melodies. These melodies get used over and over. There's only 12 notes in our music, in what they call Western music. There's only 12 notes, and the first one and the last one are the same note. Okay, so there's really 11 notes. How wrong can you go? Right? So they just keep doing it. They keep doing it over and over and over. people by the way they sing or little turns of phrasing that they use, keep coming up with clever stuff. But it's amazing how much they've wrung out of those 12 notes. I was told once, and this may be apocryphal, but I don't know, I like this story, that, you know, Juilliard, the music school in the city, when you're all done and you take that last big test, the last question, which is bonus points, it's not a, you know, it's not a you have to answer the question, it's a bonus question. They say, write 6 bars of original music. Now, a bar is 1, 2, 3, 4, second bar, 3, 4, third bar, 3, 4, fourth bar, 3, 4, fifth bar, 3, 4, sixth bar, 3, 4. Okay? Just 4, 6 times, or 3, whatever the time is. But write 6 bars, and since around 1905, no one's been able to do it. Because everything's been written. You know, you get Mozart and Beethoven and those guys, they wrote everything. They used those, they beat those 12 notes to death, you know? Me and Taylor's daughter, this is a complete aside, is in Vienna today, and she sent us a little video. She went to this concert of Mozart and Beethoven in Vienna, in this great little church, another little church, but all painted with angels and stuff in the ceiling, and music, you know. So the 19th century rolls along, the world's getting louder and louder. People start thinking, we're gonna have to make the guitars louder. Because now, people can't hear these little ones with the gut strings anymore. If you're over at the house and it's real quiet, okay, fine. But, so, the first thing they did was they started putting steel strings on them. The Italians had been putting steel strings on mandolins for a long time. I don't know how they thought of that. Nobody can seem to figure out why they thought of that, but it was a brilliant idea because it made the mandolin louder and, you know, plinkier. But they started making guitars bigger. Now this one's great. This one's from about 1937, 1936, 1937, and it's got steel strings. But by about, there's one over there, if you're walking around, if you always walk around, a black guitar made by the Gibson Company. It was made in 1905, and it's almost as big as this. This one's 19 inches across, the Gibson's 18 inches across. They made them big to try to make them louder. The steel strings really give it a... This guitar was made by, they were called the Larsen brothers, Carl and August Larsen. They came from Sweden at the end of the 1880s. They were master carpenters, and they came to Chicago, but they couldn't get work. There was a whole lot of master carpenters around, and they couldn't get any work as carpenters. But they found a job, the two of them, at this place called the Maurer Company. And Mr. Maurer had this factory that made guitars, mandolins, banjos, cheapo violins. He made cheap instruments for people. Larsen brothers come in, they know what they're doing. Even with the poor materials that Maurer had on hand, they start making pretty decent instruments. And they put steel strings on. Now, what you had to do, when you put a set of steel strings on a guitar, the amount of what they call torque, the pull on the bridge, on the headstock, the amount, when you tune it up, is between 700 and 1,200 pounds of torque on this guitar. So you've got these 6 metal strings on here trying to pull the thing apart, basically. I don't know if you can see, but in this one, there's this metal rod in the middle of the guitar, which was a Larson thing that they figured out. See that metal rod in there? They figured that out as a way of holding the guitar together. Now Martin, great Martin company, they never did that with that metal rod. So a lot of really good Martins, steel string ones, like the great ones, are from the 30s. They're worth now, some of them, $250,000, $300,000. What would happen is the neck would start to pull up and kind of sink into the body in the front. See that metal rod in there? So the neck is starting to pull up into the body. The Larson brothers put this metal rod in, and the neck on this guitar has never pulled up. There's tremendous amount of pressure on the strings. Right? Yeah, well, it's hollow actually, but it's steel, so it's. So then, if you've got one of these really good Martin guitars and you want it, when that happens and the neck starts to come up and it starts to sink down in the body, the guitar becomes really hard to play because the strings get way high up off the fingerboard and it hurts to play. And you got to kind of develop some calluses anyway to play the guitar, play steel strings. But when that happens and those strings get way up in the air, it's impossible to play. So then you have to have what's called, you got to get the neck reset. And you got to find somebody like Carlos over here that knows how to do that. And there's not a lot of people that know how to do that. Right. A lot of people do it, but they do terrible jobs and then your guitar is wrecked. You know? But you find somebody who knows how to do it, and they can reset the neck and get it back down there and get it straight. So anyway, so the Larson brothers now, they're working for Maurer. They're starting to put steel strings on things. They're starting to make good instruments. They buy the company from them. They say, get this guy out of here. We wanted this right. So they start making this great stuff. Now Martin, remember the Martin company's been around for a long time already. They're the premier guitar company, but they're nowhere near putting steel strings on yet. And they're just starting to make a little bit bigger guitars by 1905 or so. But the Larson brothers are off to the races. They're doing anything they can think of. The Gibson company out in Kalamazoo, Michigan, this man Orville Gibson, his name was, he was selling shoes. But he decided, you know, I want to figure out how to make guitars and mandolins. So he read up on it a little bit of that you could read about it at that point in the 1890s. And he went and got some big old doors off of churches and old church pews that were made out of mahogany and rosewood. And he would carve those. He knew how to carve wood. He would carve those into the shape of the guitar. And he would, if you get a second, if you haven't seen it already, look at that black 1905 Gibson that's back there. It's an real early Gibson. Anyway, he would carve the wood and make these instruments, and he made all kinds of wild shapes with curls in them. It's pretty interesting stuff. They're not exactly, the ones that he made himself are not really great instruments. They're beautiful objects, but they're not really great instruments. He sold the company in 1904, and then they got some luthiers in there, some people who knew how to make instruments. And they started sounding pretty good. And they started putting steel strings on stuff. They made a few gut string guitars right at the beginning, but Gibson's emphasis was always on steel strings. Okay, so we're into the 20th century. Guitars are getting bigger. They got steel strings. You got Gibson, you got Martin. In about 1912 or 1913, out in Seattle, there was a thing called the Columbia World Exposition. And it was kind of like a World's Fair. Like they were kind of going up against the World's Fair idea. And they brought, among many other things, they brought musicians from different places in the world. And they brought some Hawaiian musicians. Now, people in the United States here, we had never heard Hawaiian music before. And it took off. It became huge. They started selling thousands of ukuleles. Martin and Gibson started making ukuleles, you know? This became a huge fad. I don't know what to compare it to, the ice bucket challenge or something. You know, it became a real big deal. The Hawaiian and again, I can't imagine what it must have sounded like when a bunch of people from Scranton got a hold of these things trying to play Hawaiian music. So as you see, this guitar was made in Los Angeles by the company is called the Weissenborn Company, this man Herman Weissenborn. And he made exclusively these Hawaiian instruments at first. He made a few regular guitars. I say he made them. He owned the company. He had some very, very fine Mexican craftsmen working for him. They made them. And they did all the hard work and figured it all out. But the deal with the Hawaiian guitar is you play it with this steel bar. You've heard that sound, right? You know? Supposedly, this is how that happened. There was a Hawaiian man named Joseph Kekuku, K-E-K-U-K-U. Joseph Kekuku. He had a regular guitar, not a Hawaiian guitar, a regular 6-string with steel strings. He's in Hawaii. He's never been out of Hawaii. This is probably in the 1890s. He's walking along the railroad tracks and he drops his guitar. And it falls strings down onto the track. And he hears it. And he goes, yeah, okay, that's cool. And he goes home and he gets a piece of metal and he rounds it off and he smooths it down. First, I guess, he tried to play it like this, you know. That's kind of awkward. So he... Anyway, supposedly that's how it happened. Now, when I said he tried to play it maybe like this at first, but it was awkward with the Hawaiian thing, but you do see the black bluesmen from down south, from Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama, they would get a steel string guitar. And like the Hawaiians, they would tune it to a chord. Instead of E, A, D, G, B, E, like a regular guitar tuning where you finger the chords, because you're going to play it with this bar, you want it to be a chord. So you don't have to finger it, you just have the chord there. And the blues guys play blues. They didn't play Hawaiian music, they played blues, you know. So they would, you know. With this, you're supposed to have a little one that fits around your finger. But, you know, and then that became a whole thing, and 6 years later you get the Allman Brothers. Truly, grew right out of those black men down there in the deep South doing that. And, you know, Dwayne Allman was from Macon, Georgia. He heard that and he went, yep, just like Joseph Kakukin went, yeah, that's cool. Just like the guy with the single piece of gut 10,000 years ago, they went, that's good. That's music. I like that. And look what happened, you know. So, what time is it these days?
6:30.
6:30. And I
Keep
started
going.
at 5:30?
Keep going, G.
I'm almost done.
We're here for it. We love it.
Awesome. So, the Hawaiian thing happened. Now, the 1920s come along, the roaring 20s, right? Things are loud now. Now the cities are full of cars and trucks, and the horns are honking, and the factories have moved into the cities, and the whistles going off for lunch and for get over here, and you know, and the church bell's still ringing, but you can't hardly hear it anymore, can you? Barely, and all this sound. They keep trying to make guitars louder. Now, also, by now, electricity's all over the place, right? People got radios in the 20s. By 1927, there were radios pretty much around. Maybe your family couldn't afford one, but the neighbor down the way had one, and you could go sit in their place and listen with them, you know? Think about it. If you wanted to hear music before the radio came along, you had to go over to somebody's house who played, or you had to play it yourself. That's why you see all those old pictures of mom and dad and the two sisters and the brother, and they all got instruments. It's because if you wanted to hear music, you had to make it. Right? They didn't really even have, you know, the old crank-up Victrola record players. Most people couldn't afford those. Most people didn't have any of that stuff until after World War I. You know, unless you had money, then you might have some of the real early kind of wax. They had these wax cylinders. Another Thomas Edison said he invented, but maybe he didn't. Kind of thing. He was slick, old Tom. He was a promoter. Anyway, by the 20s, they're trying to still make louder. So they, out in Los Angeles, the National Guitar Company comes along, and they make these guitars. This is out of a alloy of nickel and copper that's called nickel silver. And it retained, this one's from 1930 or 31, and you still see it's still shiny. It's still beautiful. These things keep this, and jazzy type guitar players that were playing with bands would get these because they could keep up with the horn players. Because, you know, you ever sit in front of a trumpet? They're pretty loud. But with this guitar. Now, inside of this guitar, in this little screen bit here, are three, think of them as upside down pie plates. You know an aluminum pie plate? There's three of them in here. And the strings sit on a thing called the bridge, which presses down on those pie plates, and those pie plates vibrate and help toss the sound out there, you know? So, This came on. Well, this company made their first instruments right at the end of 1927 in Los Angeles, and 1928 they kind of expanded the company, and they got pretty popular for a minute. A man named Emile Dopiero was the guy that invented that idea of the upside down pie plates. And this is another one of these great stories that I just love. They're spun. It's spun aluminum, like cotton candy. You know? These fine little threads of aluminum that they spin on a lathe and shape. Now, Emile made all of them. They made thousands of these guitars. He made all of the they're called the cones, the resonator cones. He made all of them himself. He wouldn't let anybody else do it. He wouldn't teach anybody to do it. He gets sick suddenly, very, very ill. By now, he started his own company called the Dobro Company, making resonator guitars. A lot of his are made out of wood. He did make metal ones, but a lot of his are made out of wood. He turned the pie plate upside down. So now the part that the pie would be in is facing up instead of the bottom of it. But it's the same idea. It's sitting on this. He's making all these pie plates himself. He gets real sick. He's dying. He's in the hospital. His son comes to him. Dad, how do you make the damn cookies? You gotta tell me. No. He goes, that was it. They've never figured it out. There's genius guys now that have worked on this for 50, 60 years. There is now a new national company that makes the same instruments, same materials. They can't quite get the cones. They're really good instruments. They sound great, but they don't sound like the old ones. Isn't that wild? You know Les Paul? You've heard of Les Paul, that guitar player, right? Huge, post-World War II. Before World War II, he was called Rhubarb Red. He was from, I think, Kenosha, Wisconsin, one of those places. He was called Rhubarb Red. He was kind of a jazz country player. After World War II, now electric guitars have come along. Anyway, he told me that in 1927, there's radios, right? People got radios. Now, remember on the old Victrola, if you've ever messed with one, the arm that you set down on the record's spinning, you set the arm down on there, there's kind of a needle. It's basically just a thin nail on those things, and it sets in the grooves of the recording spins, it sets in the grooves, it vibrates, that vibration goes down, and is mechanically reproduced. Those were not electric. Remember, those things are just made out of wood. And that crank was for the motor that ran the turntable. That was not to make the sound. That was just to make the record go around. It was mechanically amplified in that wooden box. But they knew that there was an electrical signal going up through that little needle, that nail. So Les told me that they would take a regular acoustic guitar and they would stick that nail in the wood, jam it in there. They had soldered a piece of wire onto it, and they'd run that into the radio. And then when they played the guitar, they could just barely hear it coming out of the radio, but they could hear it. And it was a little bit louder. This is right at the end of the 20s, okay? All right. By 1933, and again, out in Los Angeles, some guys have figured out how to make what's called a pickup. Basically, a sort of a microphone. It's a magnet with a bunch of copper wire around it, wound around it, a coil. The vibration of the string gets picked up by the magnet. The magnetic field gets picked up by that coil, goes down into an amplifier, a radio, basically, and the sound gets amplified. And that's how we get electric guitars and all that noise that we got there. Jimi Hendrix, you know, he's basically got that nail stuck in the top of the guitar and going down through the radio. But of course, they've refined the ways to do it. So in the early 30s, the Rickenbacker Company, a man named Adolf Rickenbacker, makes the first commercially decent electric guitar, and it's a lap steel. It's a Hawaiian guitar, but it's made out of metal, And it's a little thing that you sit on your lap and play. Then, within the next year or so, Gibson, up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, invents their own pickup, their own microphone, although it's not really a microphone, it's a different way of making the electricity go. They invent a guitar with a good pickup in it, and boom, we're off to the races. The kind of first person to really figure out what to do with that, there were right away people that got them and played them. There's a man named Charlie Christian, a black man from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and he was so good, and he figured out that electricity. He figured out what to do with that electric guitar. He went, now I can keep up with any horn player. I can play, you know, and he would. He was great at that. Benny Goodman had like the biggest band in the country at the time. He was the Taylor Swift of his day. He was like a giant pop star. You know, we think of him like this, you know, funny old guy with the glasses and the clarinet. He was the stuff, man. He was cool, you know. But legally, he couldn't have a black man on stage. And he was in Los Angeles at a place called the Rose Room, and he's playing, and they snuck Charlie Christian onto the bandstand, and they didn't tell Benny. The guys, the cats in the band, said, listen to this guy, come on. They snuck him on way up in the back of the stand in the shadows. And Benny hears Charlie playing. He's like, oh my God, what is that? And he looks and he sees, oh, I got a black man on my stage. I'm in trouble to get arrested over here, you know. But Charlie's playing so great. We've got to do something. So he figured out a way. I don't know exactly what he did, but he figured out a way to keep it. And they made some great records. If you've never heard Charlie Christian, go on YouTube. Check it out. Charlie Christian playing with Benny Goodman. There's a song called A Smooth One. It goes. Great stuff. Check out Charlie. Good stuff. Okay, so then electric guitars come along, and I'll hit you with one more before I play a little bit of electric, and we can all go have dinner. This is just a cool guitar. It's made by Gibson. In 1933, there was a World's Fair in Chicago, right? Now, Gibson was already making really good acoustic guitars, and the next year, they're going to start making that electric guitar. But they, see all the noise They designed this for the, as a showpiece for that 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. The fingerboard here, now most of the fingerboards are made out of either ebony wood or rosewood. Ebony generally came from Africa, and the rosewood came from Brazil, a lot of it that was used, some of it from Africa. I guess some ebony, right, Carlos, comes from Guatemala? Yeah. Yeah, there's good ebony that comes from Guatemala. And then the necks were made out of mahogany, generally from Honduras. There was some very, very fine mahogany that came from Cuba, but that ran out pretty quick because Cuba ain't that big, right? So they used all that up quick on furniture, generally, but some early guitars, early 20th century guitars, made that. Anyway, they made this guitar for the 1933 World's Fair, and this fingerboard, instead of being ebony or rosewood, is made out of plastic. And in the guitar world, we call it mother of toilet seat. Take a look at that.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you've seen toilet seats made out of that stuff. So we call it mother of toilet seat. Right? You've seen that kind of plastic, right? And Even though it was just kind of a showpiece instrument, well, it turned out to be a really good guitar. And this shape of guitar, flashing, huh? Yeah. This body shape was Gibson's kind of standard body shape for a lot of the 30s, and it's still real popular. It's a guitar that, this body shape, not necessarily the mother toilet seat fingerboard, but a lot of people use cowboys like that. This is my guitar, and I love this guitar. I use this guitar. You know, I've recorded with this. I play this around the house. I really like this guitar. This one was made in very early 1934, so it's one of the early ones. They made these from late 33. I mean, like Christmas 33 until 1941, when World War II kicked off and everybody had stopped making pretty much everything. So I always like to show people this one because it's just so cool. So anyway, the electric guitar got going, like I said, in the mid-30s, but they were still just acoustic guitars with that pickup on them. They were hollow. They were carved wood, right? After World War II, in Fullerton, California, there's a man named Leo Fender, Clarence Leo Fender, and he's been repairing radios, and he's been making lap steel guitars, tiny little electric that you play with the bar on your lap. Because by then, the country music guys had gotten a hold of those and gotten away from Hawaiian music, and they're playing country. And they're playing, you know, slick. And they're playing really good. And there was a huge number of those guys that had moved from Texas and Oklahoma and places like that out to Southern California to work in the aircraft industry during the war. So there's a lot of those guys out there, and they're playing, you know, they're playing that hillbilly shit kicker music, and they want it to be loud, and they want it to be bright, and they, you know, they're doing the, that stuff, you know? Leo Fender, he's making those lap steels, and the guys keep telling him, you know, those Gibsons, they're great guitars, but we can't use them. They don't do what we need, you know? So he thinks about it for a minute. He's got a buddy named Doc Kaufman. They had the K&F company, Kaufman and Fender, making those lap steels and little amplifiers for him during the war. Him and Doc go down to the lumber yard, and they buy some pine wood, just some boards, like you make the floor with, you know. They buy some boards, and they come back, and they glue them together, and they make this body shape right here. Exactly this body shape. Tiny bit thinner, but this. And this is in the spring of 1950. And they have somebody that knows what he's doing a little bit, cut some necks out of maple and fret them up. And they put those guitars together. Solid bodies, solid wood. It's not hollow anymore. So you can play loud. The hollow guitars, when you start to play them loud, it does what's called feeding back. The body starts to vibrate from the sound because it's hollow, and that sound gets in there and it's rolling around, it starts vibrating, and it goes woo, 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 and you get all these noises that you don't want along with your music. Of course, later, starting with Charlie Christian, who I mentioned, people learned to use that feedback. There's a recording from, I think, 1940. There was a place uptown in Harlem where all the musicians would go late at night after their gigs downtown and jam. It's called Minton's. And somebody had the presence of mind to get up there with a tape recorder and record these people playing. And there's a recording of Charlie Christian. I think it's 1940, maybe early 41, because I think he died in 41. They're playing, and I think Gene Krupa was playing drums, and they finish some song, and Krupa goes, "Hey Charlie, call one." You know, tell Charlie, you pick something that we're gonna play. And Charlie goes, "Okay, yeah, B flat, 1, 2. And he hits this note, boom. Feedback in 1941, come on. He invented Jimi Hendrix. And I often thought that if Jimi Hendrix and Charlie Christian did this, and Jimmy was there and Charlie was in the 60s, same thing would have happened. It wouldn't be any different, except Charlie Christian would have been the guy going, you know, that would have been Charlie Christian instead of Jimi Hendrix. And Jimmy would have been back there going, which nobody had ever done before on the guitar. Anyway, so Leo's out there, Leo Fender, and he makes these guitars, and these country guys are playing them, and it's the early 50s now, you know, and the rock and roll thing's starting, and B.B. King even gets one, real early. And B.B.'s going, you know, yeah, people are going, oh, that's good, I like that, you know. It can be loud. The world's real loud, and they can be loud now. And we know how loud it got. You know, by the late 60s, you know, you got Pete Townsend and Hendrix and people like that, you know, with the, you got all that going on. So, from 1810 to this, it's not a straight line, but it's pretty straight. It goes Hawaiian for a minute. It gets jazzy and bluesy and all kinds of things happen, but it was basically about getting louder, getting more music to more people, you know. And that's what the guitar's always been. The guitar made my life. I wouldn't be standing here, obviously, if my mom hadn't bought me this for my 11th birthday. I would not exist as me. I'd have been something else, but I wouldn't be this lunatic that's standing here. So thank you all very much.
Questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Curious.
Yes.
How many, I don't know if you ever thought about it, but like, you know how they say people need 10,000 hours before they become. When do you think you had your first 10,000 hours?
So the woman just asked the thing about having 10,000 hours before you know what you're doing, you know, and she asked when I thought I might have had my 10,000 hours. To be serious and answer your question, I probably had my 10,000 hours by the time I was about 13 or something. But I don't think I got good until a couple years ago. Yeah, 2-3 years ago. No, probably when I'm 70 now. Probably when I was in my 50s, I started to understand what was going on. Yes, yes, sir. You, you there, fella.
Where does Gretsch fit into the puzzle?
Did you hear that?
Gretsch is a very well-known guitar maker, and where does it fit into that whole puzzle?
So he's asking about the Gretsch Guitar Company. Now, the Gretsch Guitar Company was in Brooklyn, and up until pretty recently, you could be driving over the Brooklyn Bridge and see the building there that still said Gretsch building number, what was it, 162 or something, whatever it was. Gretsch started out in the 30s making acoustic guitars, making jazz guitars with the arch top, carved, kind of like a violin, the top of a violin. Instead of having that round hole in the middle, they got what they call F-holes, those little guys down on the side. Gretsch started that, and then Gretsch got into the electric game pretty early, and by the 50s, Gretsch was making some real good electric guitars. They were real popular. They got Chet Atkins, the great, great guitarist. They got Chet Atkins on as an endorser, and in about 55, I think. And by then, TV's coming on, you know, people are starting to get televisions, or at least maybe down the block, somebody's got a TV and everybody go over and watch, especially in the South. And they're listening to the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday nights on WSM, and now the thing stops. I mean, look at it, that's a piece of art in itself. Look at that. Anyway, so Gretsch, yeah, I mean, Gretsch is in there for sure, but I see Martin, in the United States, Martin first, the Larson brothers, Gibson almost more from a marketing, being real smart about marketing, although they did make a lot of great guitars, a lot of great electric guitars. And Gretsch appealed to the country market, I think because of Chet. And then in the 60s, some rock and roll guys picked up Gretsch's, like Neil Young and Stephen Stills, from Buffalo Springfield to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, famous for playing these great big Gretsch guitars, you know, and doing all kinds of cool stuff with them.
Any other questions?
Yes?
I was wondering, the actual shape of the guitar, where you got one small round and one big round, is that purely an acoustic derivation?
Good question. I always figured it's just because of the way we're shaped. So it can sit on one leg or the other. That's what that's for. Is that to put your leg on it so it doesn't slip away. You know, people say, oh, it's the shape of a woman. It is. That's what I always have been told, and so I've talked to people about that, you know. What do you think, Carlos? Does the shape acoustically generate sound?
In a way it does, because the bottom boot is a little bigger than the top, and you are absolutely right. The waist of the guitar is to rest it on the lap.
Right.
That's exactly.
Yeah. Because, you see, when they started making this shape, in the 1930s they started, well, they made a few in 1917, but really in the 30s they started making this shape, the Martin Company. It's called the dreadnought shape. Like a big battleship. A dreadnought was a battleship. Now they've straightened the side out a bit. It's not as deeply indented, but it still sits on your leg like that. So I really think that that's what it was. People have experimented with making guitars. The Lion and Healy company in Chicago made this beautiful guitar. I've never been able to get one. It's driven me crazy for 50 years. Carl was it stopping by the woods on a snowy evening? Robert Frost. Robert Frost had one. It's shaped like a bell, but it just slides right off because it just goes straight up here. But it's such a cool guitar. I always wanted one of those. Anyway.
Thank you, Chief.
Sure.
Other questions?
So, Andy Irons from Taylor Guitar, the master Luther there, is...
I could probably hear more if
Andy Irons?
Yeah.
So Andy Irons is the master Luther. at the Taylor Guitar.
Yeah, I was just reading that in the other day.
He's doing the V-Brace, he's doing now with the 900 series. What do you think, have you played one, and what do you think?
I haven't played one of those. Lewis, right?
Yeah.
Lewis is asking about bracing inside of the guitar. Remember I told you about how that 700 to 1,200 pounds of torque, the strings are trying to pull the guitar apart? Inside of here, underneath here, now this guitar has what's called an X brace. There's pieces of wood under here to hold the top together so that the strings can't just bend that top right off of there. There's a little brace coming across here, coming across here. There's what they call tone bars down here. And the Martin Company became famous for these tone bars down here. They would do what's called scalloping. They get in there and they'd shave little bits off the end. And they'd tap that wood and they'd listen. And they had so much experience, these people had been doing it for so long, that they knew the optimum sound they could get by shaving just enough off those braces so they could still hold the guitar together, but the sound, the resonance could come out. So yeah, there's all kinds of different bracing systems that people have.
1810 have that?
The 1810 has barely any bracing. The guitar is so light it could almost float away. It's got just one across like this, and a very light brace. Now, almost every brace in every guitar, I believe on my college, is made out of spruce, right? The braces, generally, the X brace has become the popular thing on steel string guitars. They feel that generates the most sound. I don't know who invented that, but Martin certainly back in the late 1800s went to that, and it was a big deal. A solid piece of spruce, pine tree, spruce. The Larson brothers, they got the big old X brace in here, but their X brace is made a piece of spruce, a piece of ebony, and another piece of spruce for each brace. So it's a 3-piece deal. And I told you there was Carl and August Larson, the 2 Swedish brothers. Carl was known as being cranky, and August just wouldn't talk to you at all. Mean. August was mean. They worked in Chicago. They had when there were still old barns downtown in Chicago, and they were up on the 2nd floor. Les Paul told me this, I've read this, other people told me this. And you'd come up and there was a string hanging down, and you'd pull the string and it rang a bell up outside the window. And August would come and look out the window. And if he liked the look, he'd throw the key down. If he didn't, he'd just walk away. I love the Larson. I love Larson. So there's a small Larson Brothers guitar over there. They made beautiful guitars, and they would make anything. This one here, there's 6 of these known. This great big body here. 3 pairs. They made 3 pairs of them for these cowboy radio and stage bands in the 30s. And I have a picture of the man who originally owned this guitar, and his brother owned the brother of this one. You know, one of the 3 pairs. This band. And the man that got this one, he couldn't have been this high. And the thing is covering him up from his knees up to his neck. And he's got the cowboy shirt with the collar and the silver things on the end, and the bolo tie, and he's got a cowboy hat. Show business. You know, with the pearl around the edges and stuff. Anyway, any other questions?
Any other question?
Are there any guitars you're drooling over? Like if you could, your wish list of a guitar that you don't have that you wish you had?
All of them. I miss every guitar I ever sold. Even the ones that were no good. that I sold because they weren't good guitars. I still want it. I want them back. I want them all. No. It used to be, like I said before eBay, before the internet, it was pretty easy to get these. Once the internet came along, and once the international market, very quickly, in the 60s, when I was a teenager, me and the one other person in my little town that played the guitar, my buddy Eric, we somehow decided that the old guitars were better. This is like 1966, 67 by then. So I'm like 14, 15. He's a couple years older, so he's got a driver's license. And we would borrow his father's 1952 International Harvester pickup truck, and we would drive around and look for guitars. And we'd find them back then. You could find them. And they were cheap. Everything, they were real cheap. Then it turned into the used guitars, turned into vintage. And they started having guitar shows. And there were vintage guitar dealers. And it just messed the whole thing up. I remember in 1988, I went with a buddy of mine down to Texas, big guitar show in Arlington, Texas. And that was the first year that international people started showing. Japanese guys came. Suits. They looked like real businessmen. All the guitar guys were like dumpy hippies, That's what we are. We were guitar players. We were into it. These guys show up with briefcases full of $100 bills. And they would literally run through the show going, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. And they'd buy 60, 70 guitars. And they'd come back after they ran all the way through and had bought all the good stuff. They'd come back and unload a bunch of $100 bills to each guy and take the guitar. And we all went, whoa, this thing has changed. So it got hard, but it used to, I'm a cranky old guy, okay. It used to be fun. Anyway.
One last question?
Yes, sir.
Have you played any of like a new Fender, like a Stratocaster
Oh, yeah.
or something?
Sure.
How do they compare? The Fender's come out with this new Heritage 2 line. It's supposed to be exactly the same specs as the 50s and 60s. Have you ever tried one of those?
Fender, Gibson, Martin, they're still making great guitars. All they need is 40 or 50 years of somebody playing them. When I got this guitar, when I was 11, it wasn't all beat up like this. It was in pretty good shape. But I put in my 25,000 hours on it, and played it. It's been around the world 8 or 10 times. And been all over it. The wear, when you see a guitar with all this kind of wear on it, that means it was fun to play. When you get an old guitar and it's mint perfect and looks like there's something wrong with it. Nobody wanted to play it. Occasionally you'll turn one up, that's great. But anyway, yeah, they're still making really good stuff. What they can't make is the pickups. Because around 1965, the electronics in guitars radically started to sound different, and to most people's ears, not as good. What was going on in 1965? The Vietnam War. The type of magnetic material that they needed for the pickups was all going to the government. And they had to switch to different kinds of magnetic material. And it really changed. And they went from making 10 or 12,000 guitars a year to making 300,000 a year.
Wow.
So the materials suffered. The Brazilian rosewood that's used on all the great old acoustic guitars is now illegal to bring into the United States. You have to say that it's, old growth. It was cut before 1989 or whatever. Yeah, sure it was. Because there are guys that still make of guitarists at a Brazilian Rosewood, but they have to be able to sort of prove, I guess, I'm kidding. They probably really do have some that was sitting in somebody's storage for 50, 60 years. But, yeah, that's the difference. They need to be played. The guitars need to be played to get good, to sound good, but they're making quality instruments.
It's like a boat, it needs to be used, right?
Sorry?
It's like a boat.
Yeah, it needs to be used, absolutely, yeah, definitely. You know, back when the things were still sort of easy to get, I would occasionally run into one that was in great condition. You know, somebody had bought it in 1958 and took lessons for a month and went, man, that's not for me, and it went in the closet. And now it's 1970 and I come along and I get it, you know. And as they started to become more and more collectible, people would say to me, wow, you know, you're gonna take that. And when I started going on the road with bands, people would say, why do you bring your vintage guitars on the road? Well, yeah, I do, because it's a tool. That'd be like a carpenter. He goes down the store, he gets his hammer, and he goes home and he starts working, and he goes, damn, that is a good hammer. I'm not going to use it. Does that make sense? So you use them, and then they get even better. Yeah.
How many hours a day do you play? Because you have a lot of guitars you got to keep playing, right?
Yeah, well, I used to have a lot of guitars.
Oh.
At one time, I had a lot of guitars. You know, it depends on what's going on.
Yeah.
Like yesterday, I played a lot because I was in the studio working on something, but some days I don't play at all.
Oh.
It depends. That's
We
all.
have a question there, but also here.
Oh,
So
hey.
you've had this guitar since you were 11,
Yeah.
which is amazing. And basically, you showed all these other guitars already. So it's acoustic.
Sorry.
That's right. But basically, this is like a 60-year romance with this instrument, and there's nothing really that tops it. Are there any rumored innovations in electric guitar building? I mean, like
That's a great question.
in Hawaiian guitars, people are always talking about bracing innovations like that, and etc. But what about that?
Okay, that's a great question. Innovations in guitars, gut strings, steel strings, big innovation. The size of the body, big innovation. Electric, big innovation. Now we go along. The solid body after World War II, huge. Made everything, all the music that we grew up on and loved possible because of this solid body, you know? The only innovation, what I would call a real innovation that I've seen since the 50s, is a guy named Ken Parker.
Oh, yeah.
Who made a guitar called the Parker Fly. And that guitar it's a solid body electric guitar, it's a carved body, but it's unique. He figured something out. But that's the only thing I've seen that I would say is a real.
What's it called?
It's called the Parker Fly.
Parker Fly?
Fly, yeah. You look that up online and see pictures of it. I don't even think they make them.
Was there a question down there? Question with the woman there? Hi.
Hi, it's not a question, I just want to mention that the 89-year-old in Queens is actually my uncle. And I'm happy to talk to you about those guitars because it's incredible history.
Wait a minute, that's your uncle? Look next door to Jeffy Z.
I don't know who that is, but my uncle's 89, he's an amazing French jazz guitarist and violinist, plays with Django Reinhardt.
And he wants to sell his guitar?
And he's looking at how
That's amazing. It's got to be good. He's got to be 2 89-year-old guys.
there must be. They're really friends. And I basically photographed it, he's got, well, I mean, there's incredible history there, and I think
That's so cool.
Are there any other questions?
That's enough. We got to stop.